Well, my name is Ada Burton. Uh, Maiden name Waples. I was born and raised here in Rehoboth. In fact, I was born what is now the development before you cross the Canal Bridge. I was born on the Canal Bank. I was born June the 1st, 1937, to the late Hurley and Anna Mae Waples. And I was a family of six, two boys and four girls.
And how is it that your parents first came here?
Well, my father was born and raised here, and my mother was originally from Frankfort, Delaware. She married my dad and moved to Rehoboth. And that was back in the 20s, I would say. But all of us children were born here in Rehoboth. And all of us still live here in this area.
Can you tell me a little bit about your father's history? He's an original Rehoboth area person. That's very rare.
Well, my father was a self-employed. In the winter, he was what like you call a butcher. He did all the killing of the hogs for people. Raising hogs was one of the main things for the people at that time. And he would he butchered all the hogs. He would make their scrapple. He would make the sauces. And he even made the lard, the grease, what we call. And my mother was a homemaker. She did domestic work. And then there was summertime, my dad plowed people's gardens. And then he also, right up here now where they have the outlets, my dad tilled all of that property. He put in corn and also soybeans. So that was basically what he did. Those we kids at a young age, we would have to go out and work in those fields. And my dad he never was really had a job employed by anyone. But he made a living and we survived.
And I've heard about hog killing around here. A lot of people had hogs in their backyards right nearby here.
Every family had raised hogs, especially families with large family, people with a lot of children, because at that time, then some had cows, because I can remember when we had a cow, that's where we got our milk. But normally, if you didn't raise hogs, chickens, ducks, and have your vegetable garden during the summer, that is what provided the food, especially for families at that time. And a lot of times, the mothers would do a lot of canning for the winter, like canning peaches, tomatoes, the beans, and they had such thing as they called a cold pack. You would put your vegetables in the jars and you would put them in a big pot, and then you put the pot on the stove, and as the water boiled, that heat would cook your vegetables. So a lot of families did have hogs, and like I said, my dad would kill the hogs, and he would make the lard and the scrapple and the sauces for them. And he had all of the tools to do just that, the big pots to cook the meat in, and it was just by him being the only one in the neighborhood, he had a lot of people that he killed all sorts. Then in the wintertime, a lot of the men would go out rabbit hunting. And they would kill rabbits and squirrels, sometimes raccoons. That too was meat for the family.
Tell me what it was like growing up in this area as a young child. What are some of your earliest family memories?
Well, I can relate to Sundays was a very special time. Families would come together for Sunday dinners. And a lot of times cousins would come with our cousins would come together, and that was our fun time. We didn't have a whole lot of toys to play with, but we could make up things, and have fun. Because like I said, we weren't rich, but we had so much to give and offer to one another. And we could have so much fun, and sometimes we would walk almost a mile just to be with a cousin. Because I can remember we had cousins back here now, what they call the Glades, that lived in that area, and we would walk the railroad track, go down to play with them, and they would walk the railroad track to visit us. And on Saturday nights was our movie night.
Oh.
Everybody went to movie on a Saturday night.
Now, where would you go?
We would go in the town of Rehoboth. At that time, they had 3 movies: the Center, the Avenue, and the Blue Hen.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, no blacks were allowed to sit with the whites. All the black kids had to sit upstairs.
Yes.
And but that's what we were used to, so it didn't really bother us, because we wasn't used to anything else. Maybe if we had been used to it or had lived elsewhere and knew that the white and black sit together, it might would have bothered us. But we were just happy going to go see Roy Rogers and Gene Autry.
So you didn't feel in any way intimidated by that or angry about it?
I didn't feel any. Because that was what I was used to. I didn't know any different. Just like when we would go on the boardwalk, we had one special session where we sit, and I didn't feel not until later, when the things started to change, and I could see, well, I never ever thought, well, I'm just as good as they are. Why have I got to be sitting here in this little corner, or why can't I go there? But at that time, as a young kid, I mean, those thoughts never entered my mind, because to me, I thought that's how it was supposed to be.
Let me ask you back, and then I want to come back to the beach. So I'm going to back up to the movie theater. I heard there was a curtain in one of the theaters. Do you know what the purpose was, or do you remember anything about the curtain? I think it was the Blue Hen Theater that had the curtain. Do you remember anything about that?
I can't remember a curtain. The only thing I can remember about those 3 movies were all the blacks went upstairs to sit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I can't remember about a curtain.
And then you were talking about the boardwalk, sitting on the boardwalk. Do you mean there are only certain sections of the boardwalk you could sit on, as well as the beach to go to?
Well, how it was, there was one section for the blacks. Mm-hmm. Now they had the little thing, what you call the pavilion. You could sit under that, and you could walk out on the beach, but there was just a certain limit that you could go. And now if you had a job uptown and you babysit, you could walk on the whole boardwalk, because you would have the job of whom you was working for. But for the blacks to go on the boardwalk, they had a certain spot that you had to sit.
And did that mean you couldn't go into any of the other places of amusements, the games, or the rides?
No, you was not allowed to go there. And later, as I got older and realized, they called the place where we sat the crow's nest. But as a kid, I didn't know I didn't know that was a type of discrimination. But to give it the name, the crow's nest. Well, like I said, as a kid, I was just happy to go on the beach, kick your shoes off, and walk in the sand.
I wonder where that name came from. Do you have any idea who may have used or started that name?
I never ever found out where the name came from or how it got its name. But as I grew older, it was kind of resentful to me that because at that time we had a black lifeguard, and he was one of the better lifeguards. He was a tremendous, beautiful swimmer. And to have him on the boardwalk, not because they had him on the boardwalk, and he was very, like I said, he was a beautiful, wonderful swimmer. And the white people wanted him on that white part because they knew if someone went out in the water and were in danger that he would rescue them. But if he had not had that ability, he would have never ever been a lifeguard. But I remember, and he lived in the town of Rehoboth.
Is it Oswald?
Oswald Winchester.
Winchester.
His mother name was Lena. He had a brother named Jimmy. But Jimmy always lived in Wilmington area. But Oswald was a beautiful swimmer. And he was the first black lifeguard to ever be on the beach. And like I said, he lived in the town of Rehoboth because his mother used to rent rooms to people.
Now I understand where she lived was was where the Dogfish Head is now in that space.
Right.
Was it a similar building?
It was a house, a 2-story house, and like I say, like when some people would come in Rehoboth area to work for the summer, she would rent them rooms.
I see. And was it mainly African Americans she rented to?
Yes. Yes.
Because they couldn't get housing anywhere else. Is that correct?
Well, though they could get housing in this vicinity. I mean rooms, because I had an aunt, Irene White, that had a large house, and she used to rent rooms. And later, when she died, she left that house and property to my father. And when we left the Canal Bite, that's where we moved, 2 doors from the church. That's where we used to live.
Over here on Church Street.
Right.
Okay.
Now, where my brother Tootie lives, our home place was right beside his house. Right now, the home place is no longer there. It's just a vacant spot there now. But she used to rent rooms, and other people would rent the rooms out because the beach drew a lot of people from different places. They would come and work during the summer, and then after Labor Day, they would go back to their own homes.
And tell me about some of the jobs that the African American community held in Rehoboth, because they're really an integral part of the success of Rehoboth as a summer resort. Can you talk to some of the jobs?
A lot of them was waiters, cooks. A lot of them were, they came and they took care of the children. They were like what you call nowadays nannies. And they would come with the families, and they would their job was just to take care of the children. Others' job was to do the cleaning. Others' head job is to cook. Sometimes they would even have their own personal chauffeurs. But a lot of them came here as cooks and waiters. And some worked in a restaurant. They might be dishwashers and whatnot. But like I said, that was just only for the summer months. After Labor Day, everybody went back to their homes.
And these were restaurants that did not permit African American clientele. People worked there, could not be served there.
Could not be served there. You might get fortunate if you go to a restaurant. You might go to the back door, and they might serve you. But other than that, you didn't go and sit down and eat, you know. Now I remember I worked for a lady one time in Rehoboth, and she told me, she said, now from I went to the front door, and so she told me, she said, now when you come tomorrow, you come to the back door. I said, okay. And that day when I had lunch, I had to go down in her basement to eat lunch. And so when she told me, she said, now, oh, by then I was almost 20 or 21. So I said, okay. She said, now don't forget in the morning when you come to the back door. I said, fine, yes. She never saw me anymore. Because if I could go in and do her work and I couldn't come through her front door, that's when I started getting bitter about some of the things. Because at that time you got to realize a lot of our young guys were going into service and they were fighting just like the whites were. But to come home they couldn't be served, you know, that was kind of hard to take. And but as just like all my life, when I went to school, it was all black. Two room, and one teacher had about anywhere from sometime 35 to 40 kids, and that was the first up to the 6th grade.
And this was the school that is now the daycare center on Route 1, but was where the Y is on Church Street. Right. Okay.
That's the school that I went to. And that's the and I mean we got used books. We didn't get no new books. We had the used books, and we had this old big stove that sometimes it'd be so cold we had to sit in the classroom with our coats on. But we went, and my brother, he was the janitor. He kept the fire going, and sometimes there was 2 rooms, but they had a sliding door that would divide the 2 rooms. When the sliding doors were in use, it was 1 room we were in, but you could open it and make it 2. But very seldom we was always in that 1 room. And my first teacher was Priscilla Fountain. And later on the years, she had a sister-in-law that came, and she taught, so that made 2 teachers there. But when I was going, it was just the 1 teacher.
And then after that was the elementary level, then where did you go after that?
After we left the 6th grade, we went to Lewis, and that was a junior high. So then after I left Rehoboth 6th grade, we had a little graduation for the 6th grade, and I'll never forget it. I was the only one to graduate in the 6th grade. But I went on to Lewis to the 7th, and then left Lewis Junior High and went to Jason. And that was
Jason? Where, Jayson? Where was that?
Georgetown. William C. Jason. Now, at that time, Jason was about one of the best high schools around. And, well, it's a college now in Georgetown. But that was the high school.
Was it on that location where Del Tech is now? Oh, okay.
And I went to Georgetown High School. Now, I didn't graduate. I went to the 11th grade, and I guess I thought I was in love and got married. But anyway, Jason was a beautiful high school, and we had all black teachers, there. And then eventually they turned it into this college. And before my time, they had a school in Georgetown. I think it was called Richard Allen School.
Richard Allen?
Oh, yeah. But then after the kids left Jason, that was other college that they went to.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about this community, because the African American population was all located and lived, other than Ms. Winchester, all on the west side of the canal.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what, and West, what we now call West Rehoboth, wasn't always
West
called
Rehoboth,
that. What
no.
was it called?
It was just called Rehoboth. But I have heard my grandparents speak about there were black families that lived in Rehoboth on Columbia Avenue. But that was before my time, and that was just where, I had heard some of the older people talk about it. But now I can remember where we're at here right now. There was no homes. All this was woods. Now when you come in on Heaven Road, now say this is Heaven Road, any and everything over was no houses, no streets, no roads. All this was wooded area. And they came in and they started uprooting the trees, and people started bringing in homes, and the development started. Because I can remember when you came in on Heaven Road, it was the Harmons, Mr. Walt Harmon, my uncle, and then Oscar Harmon, then the Longs, then the Burtons, then the Allens, and then my grandmother. All was in that vicinity, Mr. Phillips and all. Because, like I say, none of this had developed. And the people basically had one another to depend on for their livelihood, about like helping one another with, for instance, if my dad planted that corn, like I told you, where the outlets are and all down there that he raised, well, the men in the neighborhood, 35 or 40 of them, would go out and help him pick the corn. Hoe killing, this one would help this and that one would help that. And everybody was just...
real sense of community.
Yeah, I mean, everybody was a true neighbor.
I forgot to mention that also with us today is Ms. Barbara Merriweather. And I just wanted to interrupt, because I'm asking all the questions. I didn't know if Ms. Merriweather, you had a question that you wanted to ask.
I was thinking when she was talking about this being a wooded area, I was wondering, I've heard later on there was a farm even in this area. And I don't know, was that the case up further near the center or something?
A farm?
Farm. Mr. Charlie Mills' farm. No.
There wasn't any farm here. What Mr. Charlie Mills had here was a big field with pigs.
Okay.
He had a large area with pigs. Then down from that they had a field with beans, and that was it. Because I can remember after they would pick the beans and the beans would dry, my mother would go out and get those beans. And they were dried then. And all you do was just take what shell was left and you put them in a container and you'd have your dry beans. But that's the only, unless that's what they call a farm.
Well, I guess I'm talking about later on. I guess it was in the 50s that Mr. Charlie Mills divided up some property that he had around here.
Excuse me a minute.
Okay.
Oh, that was your question?
I was saying, I heard that around, I guess it was in the 50s or something, that the area up, I guess all of West Rehoboth, I think, that's the way I understood it, but was Mr. Charlie Mills had some farms or something, and he divided up the land, and I've just never gotten a good picture of that. The migrant workers, where Mrs. Painter and some of the other people live today. What was that like?
Are you talking about Madge Painter?
No, in fact, I'm talking
Oh, you're talking about
Shirley
Victor.
Painter
Okay.
here in West Rehoboth right now.
Okay, this is that was the only farm that I'm speaking about is that I know is, like I said, about the pigs that used to be out here in the fields of beans. Now, when he decided to get rid of the pigs and the beans, there was a guy named William Painter came out with a tractor, and he was uprooting the trees and whatnot and smoothed it over to make it lots where people could really buy. And what he did, he sold those lots very, just want to say give it away, and people started buying property over here. Now, where Shirley lives at today, her husband's aunt lived there, and she passed that on to him when she died. And like I said, on the other side was no houses, and I can remember when another man named Gene Bookhammer that owned a sawmill, and he had quite a few guys work for him, and he too helped the people to get homes here. Some of the homes that were summer homes, they sold real cheap, because my godmother got one. It was about maybe 8 or 9 houses that was brought up here and put on the property. And they had, in fact, my godfather still lives, part of that home he lives in is still part of the summer home. But
And where is that located, that area, just in reference to?
that would be on Norwood Street, because that's where Victor and Shirley lives. That's where now Billy Joseph and Kenny Lingo, they bought property. They were 2 white guys. They bought property back here, and they were the first people to put up homes and rent them out. They were cement
In the
homes.
community.
Yeah, and because I remember renting from them, and even though they had running water, but they didn't have, the first 4 they put up had running water but outside toilets. The others that they put up had running water, because I guess by then everybody had to have the running water and whatnot.
And how did they get that property? Did they buy that from Mr. Mills, or did they buy that from some of the original owners here?
Mr. Mills, because he's the one that had all this property, and like I said, he had hogs out there, and he had the beans. And I guess after he didn't want to have the pigs anymore or have the beans anymore, I guess he seen that the black people needed property at homes, and that's when he started selling the property. And I mean, he sold it very cheap, because like I said, there used to be a place, where the Hillotton Junction is now.
Yes.
There used to be a place they called the Brick Row.
Oh, the Brick Row.
The Brick Row.
Oh.
Harry Ratkins owned that. And what it was a row of houses divided up in rooms. But they had a cover, looked like brick. It looked like shingles that looked like brick. But and so they called it the Brick Row. So in that Brick Row, it was a lot of people. And it was only one room. The places was one room. And that's where my godmother and godfather lived when they came up here. And when they started selling the land over here, that's when they moved from there and bought one of those summer homes from the beach, and they added on. And just about everybody that lived in that brick row bought property and put homes on it.
Do you have a sense of, you said it didn't cost very much. I've heard everything from $50 to a couple $100 for a lot. Do you have any sense of what the lots might have sold for?
About 200,
About 200.
250. And then if it was someone that Mr. Mills knew or had worked for him or was in with, probably nothing. Just like Mr. Bookhammer, Gene Bookhammer. He had guys that worked for him, and I mean, Christmas come, he bought all the children. One man had about 12 kids. I know he probably hated that, but he was really good to his workers. In fact, one of the houses around here on Norwood Street is still standing. Johnny Cannon worked for Mr. What I just called his name? Bookhammer. And he was his sawyer. He did the sawing for him. And he was really, really good to Johnny Cannon. Johnny Cannon's brother worked for him, another family member, and he was, I mean, Christmas, Thanksgiving, all of those guys, he was good.
And the sawmill was where?
The sawmill is like you go into Angola. You know, when you go across Love Creek Bridge,
Yes.
you make a left at that service station, and it's in that's where the sawmill. Because I remember my aunt was married to a guy, and he worked for him, and he lived on they lived on his property, and when he was getting ready to quit the sawmill, he bought another piece of property and put a house on there for them.
I wanted to come back.
I wanted to ask about, I think you told me something, we were talking one time at church, and you mentioned a taxi cab company that some person owned.
Yes, that was John Winston. John Winston, he originated from Maryland, and when he first came around Rehoboth, he shined shoes, and with his savings he bought a taxi cab, and there was no other cabs in the city, and his business continued to grow and grow, and by the time he went out of business, he owned about maybe 4 taxi cabs. And his cab stand was right in the town of Rehoboth. There were the Hooters.
Hooters.
That's where his cab stand was. He lived there. And he had a little restaurant to the side, and in the back he had a beautician, a lady that did hair there. And one of the ladies that drove cab for him was named Virgie Friend. She later moved in West Rehoboth, and where her house was is where, when you first come in on Heaven Road, and you pass after you pass the condominiums, that, I don't know what it is, someone told me it's a real estate there on the left. There's never been a sign hung out saying what it is. But anyway, that's where her house was.
They lived in Rehoboth proper when the cab person who owned the cab company.
They right in Rehoboth.
And she was a beautician. She lived there too?
The beautician would come there.
Okay.
But Virgie, she was something like co-owner, I guess, with John Winston. because she drove taxi. And she helped to run the little restaurant. Like when people would come in and wait, they may want a sandwich or a soda. Well, this is what Virgie would do when she wasn't driving taxi. And his business grew where he had to hire other people to drive taxi. And I guess after they saw that this was a going thing, then other people started running taxi. There was a Bernie Cab, and the other one, I can't remember it right now, but two other people went into that. So after those two people went into driving cab, John Winston's business sort of went down to nothing.
These other two were white people?
They were white people. White people. Because I can remember Bernie, and I can't remember the other one right now. But I knew a guy worked there. He drove cab. His name was Mike.
What time was that about? Do you remember the years approximately?
When John Winston started his cab, I would say in the 50s. In the 50s. And they even said he had did so well he bought a airplane. But I remember John Winston because he had a brother that lived over here. And when you come in on the left, you see that long building on the left hand on Heaven Road. Well, the house beside that, that's where his brother Joe used to live.
Now, I wonder today, I don't know how many people, African American people, live downtown and have businesses or doing things. Anything existent today?
That black people own?
Yes, in that 1 mile radius called, 1 mile square called Rehoboth Beach.
I don't know of any black people that has any type of business or not to my knowledge. But I do know that there has been attempts to, start business, but it didn't get off the ground at all.
Oh, I find that very fascinating.
Oh, I want to ask more about the vibrant West Rehoboth community. At one time, this was quite a self-contained, special place. And because of the limitations of segregation, this area created entertainment areas and lounges and restaurants.
Yeah.
Can you describe at its heyday what was West Rehoboth really like?
Well, I can remember a lady named Edna Knoll, some call her Edna Brown. She owned a restaurant. She rent rooms, and she had little houses that she also rent. And in there, you could go and shoot pool, and she had a jukebox that you could go in and play music. And she loved to cook, so she was always cooking. And then there was the Dewdrop Inn, that was a bar. Then there was the Wayside Inn. And there was a place they called a Horseshoe Inn. That was owned by Oswald's mother, Lena. And then for recreation, like I said, the kids basically made their own little thing as they went. Well, we might do this. But because they were of money and they were limited to what they could do, they just did what they could for enjoyment and pleasure. Sometimes we just sit around and play checkers. Some may have play cards, or some might just do whatever. But they were limited to what they could do at that particular time. Now, one thing I can say about living in this area, it wasn't that they felt cheated because they wasn't used. If you're not used having anything, you can't miss it. But then a lot of them when they got older, they moved away, or some guys might went into service or something like that to better their education, to better their life. But we used to. I remember when I was a little girl. Well, when we were little, we had a pony, and then later my dad had horses, and then he had mules. And the thing about it, when those horses and mules, they just draw other kids from all over the neighborhood. If they didn't get to ride the pony, they got to ride in the wagon. I mean, just anything, just for a little bit of excitement. So that was a good thing too, horseback riding. And we had that on Saturdays. And of course, a lot of times when we went out and worked, we had to work when we were growing up. And
you had mentioned some of the field work.
Yeah, and and in the summertime we would love to go out and pick blackberries and blueberries like that. But we didn't have, like I say, we didn't have a whole lot, but we had each other.
Well, let me go back to some of the establishments here.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard about Miss Edna's. Whereabouts was that located?
Right when you coming down here on Burton Avenue,
Mm-hmm.
her place was located the second house on the left.
As we're heading down,
Here.
heading north. Okay.
Now, when you came in here, down here to see me, the very house on the left was where her house was, and she had little 2 or 3 room cottages like that she rented out to people, and like I say, her restaurant was basically always open, and the kids would go there and play the jukebox and shoot pool, and she always had food.
And then we've heard so much about the Dewdrop Inn.
Well, the Dewdrop
Tell us
Inn,
about that.
the Dewdrop Inn was operated by Oscar Harmon, and but I'm trying to think, was his bar before the Wayside. I believe they might have been open by the same time. But anyway, the Dewdrop Inn, when you turn to come in here, that little vacant lot that sits on your right, that's where it sit at. And across the road was the proprietor house. It was his house set there, and he had about 8 or 9, maybe 10. I call them cabins, where he rented out to people. And after he was killed, I think maybe
How was he killed?
his wife killed him. Yeah. One of those unfaithful tragedies, And after he died, the Dewdrop went into other people's hands, and it just went down after that. It was never the same after Oscar died.
Yeah. And then the Wayside, is that
The Wayside Inn, that it was located right across from the YMCA. In that development, like Burton Village. That's where, and then he also had little cottages that he rented, 2 and 3 rooms, right behind the Wayside Inn. The owner of that was John Allen, and that man owned a whole lot of property in Rehoboth. Now, when you're going in the town of Rehoboth on your left, just before you cross the bridge, all of those apartments or those, he owned all that behind. Because when we were living on the canal bank, he lived behind us, and he had his house there, and he had property. Like you go into Bay Vista, he had property all over.
But he was not an African American man.
Yes, he was.
He was.
Yeah.
So how did he come by all of this
I
property?
don't know how he come by all that property. It's just like my Aunt Irene. She had an awful lot of property. But you know what I really believe? I believe that when some of those older people were in Rehoboth, they left Rehoboth at one time. And they went away and they worked in Philly, New York, and places like that. And after working away, they saved an awful lot of money because they had jobs that paid. And when they came home, back home, they could buy that property. Property was really, really cheap at the time because my aunt owned from where the church is all the way to that corner and all the way back. But she sold some of the property. And her husband, he worked on a train. And when they put their money together, the property that they bought and in the location it wasn't that expensive. That's why they could buy that property.
One of the things Barbara was mentioning.
And then too, there were some white people that left property to the black. They
But
did.
it was over on this west side, or
Now, Mr. John Allen was over here by the bridge, over here and down. I mean, they tell me he had property out there in the Jimtown area.
that's way out west
Mhm.
from here.
A lot of property. He owned a lot of property. My dad's people owned a lot of property too. And because where my uncle and where my grandmother and where my aunt lived, all that my dad owned. But my dad was the type of person, if you were in need and he could help you, he'd help. And he wouldn't take money. He wouldn't take any money. And that's the reason why we were lucky to end up with what we did have.
Well, one of the questions, Mrs. Burton, you were talking with us some about the oyster shucking in the area and the business nearby that supplied the restaurants in town. Can you explain more about that to us?
Well, there was a man, Walter Lehman, and he had an oyster camp where he gave homes to those people that chucked the oysters. And they would chuck the oysters down on the camp, and then the oyster was brought from the camp to the other plant where they would make oyster stew, and they would bread the oysters. And I worked there for a couple seasons because some months they couldn't work because they didn't use the oysters. But my job was to take the oysters out of the pan of batter and lay in a long pan of the bread. These oysters were completely covered with the bread, and then later they were packed in boxes. Sometimes the oysters were put in cans and shipped to various places. So that at that time, that was a pretty good paying job for the period for that time of year. I mean, for that. But that, I don't know how long it lasts, but it didn't last forever. But the oyster stew and the fresh oysters in the can and the breaded oysters is what they did at Allen Kirkpatrick. And down on the camp is where they shuck the oysters. And then sometimes they would bring in oysters that was already chucked from out of Maryland or Virginia.
And those were used, some of these were used in town? In the
Yeah,
rest-
some of those oysters was used in the restaurants and various places.
And there are people who came and brought that expertise originally to the area. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, those people that brought this to here, brought it here, they made their homes here, and some still are living around here. Some might have went back to Virginia, but because see that over in Lewis, they had the big clam factory. In Rehoboth, they had the oysters.
And that was right outside here, beyond Church Street, going down toward the canal that way. Is that correct?
That was like you're going to Dewey Beach. That development, before you get to the bridge
On the right.
on the right.
I wanted to come back to Rehoboth history. Do you have any recall of the events of World War II?
But the only thing that I can really remember is when my dad would put an arm badge on and another badge he put on and a flashlight, and he would go around the neighborhood and make sure that there was no light being seen in the people's homes. And sometimes if he saw a light, he would knock on the door and he would tell the people that he could see a light. And that's about basically big. It seemed like we would sit in the house, well, being young, it seemed like for hours and hours we would just have to sit in the dark. And that was his job, to go around. There would be a alarm go off, a real piercing sound, and he knew then that he was to go in the neighborhood and check for, make sure nobody had any lights on.
They had blocked people like that all over in town. Rehoboth.
Yeah. And I can also remember when my mother had, I call it ration, things were rationed. And each child had a book, a stamp. If you were going to buy a pair of shoes, you had to have that little stamp. If you were going to buy sugar, it was various things that was rationed, and you couldn't get it unless you had that stamp. I remember that, and I was very young, but I remember that.
Were you here during the storm of '62? Do you remember the big storm? Did it impact the area?
No, was that Hazel? I'm trying to think. Because I can remember 2 or 3 storms. I can remember 62. No, no. The storm I'm thinking about was before 62 because my sister was 5 years old. That's the time I got blew away by the wind.
Oh, tell me about that.
Well, what had happened, we had this terrible storm, a hurricane, and we were at our grandmother's, and my mother came to get us, and my sister was a baby, and I was about 5 years old, and my brother Gus, my mother had told my brother, says, hold her hand, and I was to hold on to her, and he was supposed to hold on to my hand. But some kind of way, we got disconnected and the wind was carrying me right down the railroad track. And my mother had to run and get me. And I never will forget it, when we got home, the house was flooded. So she hurried and heat water, give us a warm bath, got us settled down. That's when our cows and horses, all that had gotten out. And my dad was in the hospital with appendicitis. And now that's the first, I'll never forget that storm. And I remember we had a storm in '54. I think that might have been Hazel.
Well, I'm pretty close to out of questions. I have to thank you so much for sharing so much of your memory with us today.
Yeah.
Are there any final additions or thoughts you'd like to make at this time before we close?
Well, only thing is, like I say, I think Rehoboth is a beautiful place, and I wouldn't want to trade it for another place to have been born and raised up. I mean, like I say, we weren't rich, but we had each other, and we had the love of our parents and our family. And I'm just blessed that I'm able to be at the age of 72, that I have the activity of my limbs and my mind, that I can go back and think about the things that as we growed up and how far we have come. I mean, you know, from the time of sitting at the little space and now you can walk the boardwalk and go in restaurants, and I mean you know, you're somewhat equal to we've come a long ways.
Thank you so much. I don't have anything else. I appreciate your time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And thank you.